A wealthy man spat on a poor girl selling crafts, and when his horse witnessed it, it reacted in an incredible way by throwing its owner to the ground. Ancient secrets came to light, and their lives changed forever in ways no one could have predicted. A story of redemption, justice, and unexpected connections that transcend social barriers. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. The sun beat down like molten gold on the Florida Everglades, filtering through the cypress trees and dappling the ground with shimmering light. A lone figure, a man etched by time and the elements, moved along a barely discernible trail, marked only by animal tracks and the ghosts of ancient Seminole paths. Mateo Reyes stopped abruptly. At 53, his body still held the strength of a man who'd wrestled with, and for, nature his entire life. His sun-baked skin had the hue of terracotta, and his amber eyes, the color of wild honey, seemed to hold the ancestral wisdom of the land. A subtle sound, barely audible above the constant hum of insects and the chirping of birds, caught his attention. It wasn't the distant roar of an alligator or the crackle of branches under the weight of a wild boar. It was different, a watery murmur, almost musical, seeming to call to him from the earth itself. "Impossible," he muttered. No river or creek flowed through this area that he knew of, and he'd roamed these swamps since childhood. Curiosity, that instinct which had often landed him in trouble and just as often saved him, tugged at him like an invisible thread. Pushing aside vines and dodging thorns, Mateo left the trail, venturing deeper into the heart of the untouched wilderness. The sound grew stronger, more distinct. Water, undoubtedly, but not the simple flow of a stream. It was as if the water sang, as if each drop held a different note in a primordial symphony. When the vegetation finally parted before him, Mateo gasped. Before him lay a sinkhole, a cenote, unseen on any map, any tourist guide, any local legend. A perfect circle of crystalline water, so transparent it seemed like liquid air, surrounded by limestone walls rising several feet, forming a natural well. But what paralyzed Mateo wasn't the cenote itself. He'd seen dozens in his years as a guide before retiring to solitude, but what was within it? At the exact center of the water's mirror, where sunlight pierced to form a perfect cylinder reaching into the depths, something glowed with its own light. A pulsating sphere the size of a soccer ball, shimmering in hues ranging from turquoise to indigo, emitting flashes as if it contained stars within. Mateo instinctively recoiled, colliding with the trunk of a cypress tree. The object or creature or whatever it was seemed to react to his movement. The luminous sphere rose slightly above the surface, and the water around it began to form perfectly symmetrical miniature whirlpools, as if performing a ritual dance. The musical sound intensified, becoming almost hypnotic. It was like hearing the song of a whale, but transposed to an unknown dimension, more ethereal, older than any human language. A sudden gust of wind rustled the cypress tops, breaking the momentary spell. Mateo shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. Was he hallucinating? Some toxic plant he'd brushed against, the exhaustion of a long trek under the relentless sun. He took a step toward the cenote, then another. The luminous sphere remained motionless, as if waiting. Reaching the edge, Mateo knelt and gazed directly at the mysterious presence. "What are you?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. To his utter astonishment, the sphere emitted a more intense flash and rose completely out of the water, suspended a foot above the surface. Then something happened that would forever challenge his understanding of the world. The water of the cenote began to rise in thin columns like threads, forming three-dimensional symbols in the air, vaguely reminiscent of Seminole glyphs, but infinitely more complex and fluid. A message. This thing was communicating with him. A lightning bolt illuminated the clear sky, followed by a thunderclap so powerful that Mateo felt the ground vibrate beneath his feet. The sphere pulsed one last time with blinding intensity, and then, in an instant, plunged into the depths of the cenote, leaving only concentric ripples on the crystalline surface. Mateo remained motionless, kneeling by the edge of the stone, with the absolute certainty that his life had just changed forever. Mateo Reyes's cabin stood solitary on the edge of the Everglades, where the swamp gave way to a small clearing. Built primarily from natural materials, cypress wood, palmetto thatch, walls partially covered with wattle and daub, It blended with the landscape as if it had grown naturally from the ground. Inside, the space was austere but functional. A hand-woven hammock hung from two beams. In a corner, a stone hearth served for cooking and heating the place during cool nights. A rustic table held a few worn books, mostly on botany and Seminole traditions, and various tools hung on the walls. A well-sharpened machete, fishing nets, sisal ropes. Mateo mechanically lit the old kerosene lamp. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly. He still couldn't fully process what he'd witnessed at the cenote hours earlier. He poured himself a cup of coffee brewed that morning and warmed it over the newly revived fire. The familiar aroma helped anchor his scattered thoughts. As he sipped slowly, he mentally reviewed every detail of the encounter, trying to find some rational explanation. Throughout his life, he'd heard numerous local legends about water spirits, supernatural entities inhabiting sacred sinkholes. The ancient Seminoles believed these natural wells were portals to the underworld, but Mateo, despite his deep respect for the ancestral culture, had always considered these stories as metaphors, not literal descriptions. What he'd seen today defied any categorization. A glint caught his attention. On the table next to the books, something glowed faintly. Mateo approached, intrigued. It was a tiny drop of water, but it didn't behave like one. It didn't spread or evaporate. It maintained its perfectly spherical shape and emitted an almost imperceptible turquoise glow. It must have adhered to his clothing during the encounter with the sphere. With infinite caution, Mateo extended his index finger and touched the minuscule liquid sphere. On contact, the drop climbed his finger as if it had a will of its own, leaving a luminescent trail that vanished in seconds. It felt neither cold nor hot. In fact, he could barely feel its physical presence, as if it were halfway between matter and pure energy. The drop stopped at the exact center of his outstretched palm and began to slowly expand until it reached the size of a marble. Its glow intensified, illuminating the entire cabin with a pulsating bluish light, as if following the rhythm of an invisible heart. Mateo remained completely motionless, fascinated and terrified in equal measure. The tiny sphere began to emit a melodious hum, similar to the one he'd heard in the cenote, but more intimate, as if whispering directly to him. Then, images began to form in his mind. They weren't external visions, but direct projections into his consciousness, infinite expanses of water that were not earthly oceans, crystalline structures of impossible geometries, beings of light and water moving in perfect mathematical harmonies, and an overwhelming sense of purpose, of message, of warning. When the images ceased, Mateo found himself sitting on the dirt floor of his cabin, drenched in cold sweat. The drop had disappeared, but a slightly luminescent circular mark persisted on his palm. With trembling hands, he lit his old leather journal and began frantically sketching the images he had witnessed, trying to capture every detail before they faded from his memory. The following days passed in a fog of confusion and wonder. Mateo alternated between periods of intense activity, filling pages and pages of his journal with drawings and notes, and long moments of silent contemplation, sitting in front of his cabin, watching the edge of the swamp as if expecting something or someone to emerge from it. His daily routine, once meticulously structured, had dissolved. Sometimes he surprised himself walking toward the cenote without realizing when he'd started the journey. Other times he spent hours looking at the mark on his palm, which appeared and disappeared without any apparent pattern. One morning, while gathering firewood near the creek that supplied water to his cabin, Mateo felt a presence. Turning around, he saw a small figure observing him from a distance. It was Ixchel, a 12-year-old girl from the nearest Seminole community, who occasionally brought him fresh tortillas or peppers in exchange for medicinal plants he collected. "Mr. Sareyes," she greeted him shyly. "My grandmother says you haven't gone into town in many days. She asks if you're sick." Mateo tried to smile, aware of how strange he must look. His beard, normally trimmed, had grown unkempt. His eyes showed the weariness of sleepless nights. "I'm fine, little one, just occupied with some discoveries." The girl looked at him curiously, her eyes black and bright as mangrove seeds, fixed on the palm of his hand, where the luminescent mark had begun to glow softly. "Your hand," she said, pointing. "It has the mark of the water keepers." Mateo froze. "What did you say?" "My grandfather tells stories about them, beings who live in the deepest sinkholes, where the water connects to other worlds." The girl spoke with the naturalness of someone repeating a familiar tale. "He says that when the earth is in danger, they seek someone to speak to." "Ixchel," said Matteo, kneeling to her height, "is your grandfather still alive?" The girl nodded. "It's Don Kinich, the one who knows the plants and the stars. Could you take me to him? I need to hear those stories." Ixchel's eyes lit up. She nodded vigorously and with a gesture invited him to follow. As they walked along the path leading to the small settlement, Matteo noticed that the mark on his palm pulsed more intensely, as if responding to his decision to seek answers. The village of Okeechobee consisted of about 30 houses scattered around a central square dominated by a small colonial church and a monumental cypress tree. Upon arrival, several curious glances followed them. Matteo rarely went down to the village, and when he did, it was for specific needs, exchanging furs for tools, selling wild honey, buying coffee or salt. Ixchel led him to a house at the edge of the settlement. Unlike the other buildings, more modernized with metal roofs and block walls, this one maintained the traditional Seminole style, circular with a conical palmetto roof and wattle and daub walls painted indigo blue. In the front yard, surrounded by meticulously arranged medicinal plants, an old man was carving a small figure from cypress wood. His face, furrowed with deep wrinkles like cracks in dry earth, showed the serenity of someone who has seen enough not to be easily surprised. "Grandpa," Ixchel called, "I've brought Mr. Reyes. He has the mark on his hand." The old man looked up. His eyes, surprisingly clear in contrast to his dark skin, rested first on Matteo and then on his outstretched palm, where the mark now glowed with undeniable intensity. "I was expecting you," he said simply, as if Matteo's visit were as predictable as the sunrise. Don Kinich set aside the figure he was carving, a jaguar with solar markings on its back, and pointed to a small bench beside him, inviting Matteo to sit. With a kind gesture, he dismissed his granddaughter, who ran off toward the village square. "Your questions must be very important for you to have left your solitude," the old man commented with a slight smile that barely curved his cracked lips. "I've known you since you arrived in these lands how long ago? 15 years? And I've never seen you seek company unless absolutely necessary." Matteo extended his palm, where the mark continued to pulse with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the sounds of the surrounding swamp. "I found someone in a sinkhole I didn't know existed," he began, surprised at how difficult it was to describe the experience with ordinary words. "A sphere of light and water that seemed conscious. It communicated something to me, though I don't know exactly what. And it left this on my hand." Don Kinich observed the mark without showing surprise, as if examining a familiar type of medicinal plant. He took Matteo's hand between his own, dry and calloused like tree bark, and brought it close to his face, studying it with those eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical. "The ancients spoke of the Ahail," he finally said, "the water beings. They are not gods or spirits, as we normally understand these terms. They are inhabitants of another plane that intersects with ours in certain sacred places, mainly very deep sinkholes." The old man rose with slow but precise movements and entered his house. He returned moments later with a bundle wrapped in sisal cloth, dyed with symbols that Matteo vaguely recognized as variations of Seminole glyphs. "This codex has been in my family for 17 generations, he explained, carefully unwrapping what turned out to be a book made of palmetto bark with pages covered in pictograms and inscriptions. "It's not one of the ones the Spanish burned. It was hidden in a dry cave and preserved by my ancestors." With reverent fingers, Don Kinich turned the fragile pages until he found the one he was looking for. On it, an illustration showed a sinkhole in cross-section, with luminous spheres floating both on the surface and in the depths. Human figures knelt at the edge, receiving what appeared to be marks or symbols on their hands. "The Ahail don't fully belong to our world," the old man continued. "They exist simultaneously here, and in another place that the ancients called the realm of infinite waters. According to the scriptures, they only manifest when there is a serious imbalance that threatens the network of water that connects all the sinkholes, underground rivers, and eventually the ocean." Matteo felt a chill run down his spine. "Imbalance, like pollution?" Don Kinich nodded gravely. "That, or alterations in the natural flows of groundwater. The Seminoles understood that beneath the entire peninsula there exists a system of interconnected rivers and caverns, as vast and complex as the circulatory system of a gigantic living being. Any damage to this network was considered a wound to the body of the Earth itself. Matteo recalled the images the sphere had projected into his mind: crystalline structures, fluid geometries, mathematically perfect. "Why did it choose me?" he asked, more to himself than to the old man. Don Kinnich closed the codex and wrapped it again with the protective cloth. The Arhail don't choose at random. According to tradition, they seek people who have a special connection with water and who for some reason are, how to say it, receptive. People whose souls have empty spaces that can be filled with a greater purpose. Matteo looked away, uncomfortable with the accuracy with which the old man had described his inner state. Since the tragedy that had led him to leave Miami and take refuge in the solitude of the Everglades, his life had effectively been an empty vessel, barely kept afloat by the basic routines of survival. "The mark on your hand is both a gift and a responsibility," Don Kinnich continued. "It allows you to perceive things that others cannot see. Underground flows, connections between seemingly separate waters, perhaps even communicate with the Arhail. But it also means that you have been chosen to resolve the imbalance, to heal the wound in the system." "I'm nobody," Matteo protested. "Just a man who wanted to be alone, who came here to forget, not to become whatever this implies." Don Kinnich smiled with genuine compassion. "No one comes to the Everglades just to hide, although that's what everyone says at first. The Everglades is a mirror, Matteo. It shows you who you really are when everything else has been stripped away. And it seems that what remained in you, when the layers of pain and rejection were gone, was something that the Arhail recognized as valuable." The old man got up again, this time heading toward a small structure at the end of the yard. He returned with an object wrapped in red cloth. This staff belonged to the last H-men who had contact with the Arhail almost 80 years ago, he said, handing it to Matteo. "It's carved from cypress wood, which grows with its roots always seeking water even in the driest lands. It will help you perceive underground flows." Matteo unwrapped the staff with trembling hands. It was a rod about 3 feet long, polished by use and time. Intricate water-related symbols, spirals, waves, stylized drops, ran across its entire surface. Holding it, he perceived a slight hum, as if the object responded to the mark on his palm. "What should I do now?" he asked, overwhelmed by all he had discovered. "Return to the sinkhole," Don Kinnich replied. "But this time, go not as an observer, but as a communicator. The Arhail tried to show you something important. Now that you have the staff and the knowledge, you will be able to understand it more clearly." As he prepared to say goodbye, a pang of doubt pierced Matteo. "How can I be sure I'm not simply losing my mind? That all this isn't an elaborate hallucination created by my solitary mind?" The old man's eyes fixed on his with penetrating intensity. "Madness confines us within ourselves, Matteo. What is happening to you is opening you to the world, to responsibilities beyond your own concerns. Madness narrows, purpose expands." With these words echoing in his mind, Matteo set off back to his cabin, the staff firmly held in his marked hand, the other holding the small package of food that Don Kinnich's wife had insisted on preparing for him. The sun was beginning its descent behind the trees, painting the Everglades in golden and reddish hues. The usual sounds, the singing of birds, the buzzing of insects, the occasional crackle of branches under unseen paws, now seemed charged with meanings he would have previously ignored. It was as if his senses had expanded, tuning into previously inaccessible frequencies. Upon reaching his cabin, Matteo was surprised to find Ixchel waiting for him in the small clearing in front of the entrance. Next to her was a bundle of cloth that turned out to be a carefully woven fishing net. "My grandfather says you'll need it," the girl explained with the seriousness of someone carrying out an important mission. Not for fish, but for collecting messages from the water. Before Matteo could ask more, Ixchel added, "He also says you shouldn't go to the sinkhole alone, that someone who sees with fresh eyes should accompany you." "You mean you?" Matteo asked, confused. The girl nodded solemnly. "Children can see what adults have forgotten how to see." Matteo felt a mixture of concern and resignation. The idea of taking a 12-year-old girl on a potentially dangerous expedition worried him, but something in the firmness of her gaze told him that trying to dissuade her would be futile. "Tomorrow," he finally conceded, "we'll leave at dawn, but I need your parents' permission." "My grandfather already spoke to them," Ixchel replied with a small smile. He said, "I'll be safer with you in the Ahail than anywhere else." As he watched the girl walk away along the path toward the village, Matteo wondered what kind of strange mission he had embarked on. He hadn't sought any of this. He had only wanted peace, solitude, distance from a world that had taken everything he loved. And yet here he was, marked, chosen, suddenly connected to ancestral traditions and beings that defied his understanding of the universe. That night, as he packed his backpack for the next day's expedition, Matteo made a decision. If he had truly been chosen for some greater purpose, he would fulfill it. Not for himself, he had long since given up any personal ambition, but out of respect for Don Kinic, out of responsibility toward Ixchel, and out of a growing curiosity about the mysterious Ahail and the apparent danger threatening the waters that gave life to the Everglades that had become his refuge. The mark on his palm glowed with renewed intensity, as if approving his resolution. Dawn was just beginning to paint the sky with pinks and oranges when Ixchel appeared in the clearing in front of the cabin. She carried a small backpack woven with brightly dyed sisal fibers and, surprisingly, a small but well-sharpened machete strapped to her belt. "My father insisted," she explained, noticing Matteo's gaze. "He says a Seminole person never enters the Everglades unarmed, no matter their age." Matteo nodded approvingly. Despite his initial reservations, he was beginning to appreciate the girl's presence. There was in her a perfect blend of respect for tradition and natural curiosity that reminded him of himself when he was young, before city life and subsequent personal tragedies eroded his connection with the natural world. "Are you ready?" he asked, adjusting the straps of his own backpack. Ixchel nodded with restrained enthusiasm. Her eyes shone with anticipation, but her posture reflected the seriousness with which she took the mission. They set off in silence. Matteo went ahead, occasionally clearing a path with his machete when the vegetation became too dense. Ixchel followed closely behind, attentive to every sound and movement around them. Occasionally the girl stopped to pick up a plant or point out some animal track that Matteo, despite his years in the Everglades, would not have noticed without her help. "You learned well from your grandfather," he commented during a brief rest. "He says the Everglades is always talking," Ixchel replied. "You just have to know how to listen." As they approached the sinkhole, Matteo noticed something strange. The staff Don Kinic had given him, which he now used for support during the walk, began to vibrate subtly. The mark on his palm responded with a more intense glow. "We're close," he murmured, more to himself than to Ixchel. The girl, however, seemed equally sensitive to the proximity of the sacred place. Her pace became more cautious, almost reverent, and her eyes continuously scanned the surroundings as if searching for signs invisible to most. When they finally reached the clearing where the sinkhole opened, they both stopped dead in their tracks. The place had changed, not physically. The limestone walls still formed the same perfect circle, the water remained crystalline, but in its atmosphere, in the energy it emanated, the water was no longer calm. Without wind to agitate it, the surface rippled in concentric patterns emanating from the exact center where Matteo had seen the luminous sphere days before. "They're waiting for us," Ixchel whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the strange musical hum now emanating from the water. Matteo took a step forward, then another, guided by a force that seemed to pull at the mark on his palm. Reaching the edge of the sinkhole, he knelt and extended the staff until its tip touched the water's surface. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The point where the wood and water met began to glow with a turquoise luminosity that quickly spread across the entire surface of the sinkhole. The musical hum intensified, becoming a complex melody that seemed to contain countless interwoven voices. From the center of the water, the sphere Matteo had seen in his first encounter emerged again. This time, however, it did not rise alone. Dozens of smaller spheres accompanied it, forming a three-dimensional constellation that floated 1.5 feet above the surface. Ixchel, who had remained a few steps back, let out a sound between a gasp and a laugh. "They're beautiful," she exclaimed with the pure admiration that only children can express in the face of wonder. Matteo was surprised that the girl could see them. Hadn't Don Kinic said that only those marked by the Ahail could perceive them completely? Perhaps there was something special about Ixchel too, some natural sensitivity that connected her to these beings. The spheres began to move in harmonious patterns, creating what appeared to be a dance choreographed with mathematical precision. As they moved, The water beneath them responded, rising in thin columns that formed three-dimensional symbols, similar to those Matteo had seen in his first encounter. "They're trying to communicate," Matteo said, trying to decipher the meaning of those aquatic symbols. "Not just trying," Ixchel replied with surprising confidence. "They're speaking. Look closely, Mr. Reyes." The girl pointed toward the constantly changing water formations. To Matteo's astonishment, the symbols began to transform into more recognizable shapes, hydrographic maps of the region showing not only the surface bodies of water, but also the complex system of underground rivers that connected all the sinkholes of the peninsula. Matteo then understood why Ixchel could interpret the symbols so easily. They were not abstract but precise representations of the natural world, something she was deeply familiar with thanks to her grandfather's teachings. "They're showing something that's wrong," the girl said, her face suddenly somber. "Look there, where the lines are interrupted." Indeed, in the floating aquatic map, several of the connections between sinkholes appeared blocked or distorted, particularly in an area that Matteo recognized as the zone where construction of a huge hotel complex had recently begun. "The Everglades Water Project," he murmured, recalling the spectacular ads that had appeared on the main highways. They promised it would be environmentally responsible. The main sphere, larger than the others, separated from the group and floated directly toward Matteo. As it approached, it projected new images, enormous machines drilling into the karst soil, concrete being poured into underground caverns, chemicals seeping into pristine aquifers. "They're not just building on the surface," Matteo understood with growing horror. "They're sealing caverns, diverting underground rivers for their pools and golf courses." The sphere pulsed intensely, confirming his interpretation. Then it projected a new series of images, the damage spreading like an infection, sinkholes drying up, underground rivers stagnating, aquatic life dying slowly, and finally, the Everglades itself withering without the vital sustenance of groundwater. "They're killing the earth," Ixchel whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "My grandfather said this would happen if we forgot to respect the water keepers." The main sphere moved even closer to Matteo, almost touching the mark on his palm. The contact was not physical, but energetic. A current of knowledge flowed directly into his consciousness. He then understood that the Ahail were not simply passive guardians or ethereal spirits. They were an ancient and advanced life form, born in the aquatic depths of the peninsula long before the first humans set foot on these lands. They had coexisted peacefully with the Seminoles, who recognized their sacred nature and built their entire civilization in harmony with the hydrological system that the Ahail both protected and inhabited. But now that millennial balance was threatened by ignorance and greed, "What can we do?" Matteo asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem and his newly discovered responsibility. The answer came not as words but as images, himself using the staff to locate specific points where the flow of groundwater could be restored, Ixchel communicating the message to her community, people gathering to protect the sacred sinkholes, and finally, the Ahail emerging in multiple locations, establishing a new alliance with humans willing to listen. "We need help," Matteo said, understanding that this task was too great for him alone. "We need more people to see what we see." As if responding to his words, the main sphere began to divide. Small, luminous drops detached from it, floating toward Matteo and Ixchel. One landed on the girl's hand, leaving a mark similar to the one Matteo wore, though less intense. The other drops remained suspended in the air, waiting. "They're for the others," Ixchel understood with surprising intuition. "For those who are willing to help." Matteo nodded, feeling a plan begin to form in his mind. If the Ahail could communicate through these marks, and if enough people received the message and acted accordingly, perhaps there would be a chance to stop the destruction before it became irreversible. "We must return to the village," he said, carefully storing the luminous drops in a small glass vial he carried for collecting resins. "Your grandfather will know who is worthy of receiving these marks." As they prepared to leave, the main sphere emitted a final flash and plunged back into the depths of the sinkhole, followed by its cohort of smaller spheres. The water gradually returned to its usual calm, although Matteo knew he would never again see a sinkhole in the same way. On the way back, Ixchel walked with renewed energy, occasionally stopping to show Matteo signs he would have previously overlooked. Roots desperately seeking water in increasingly dry soil, animals digging deeper than usual, plants blooming out of season in an attempt to reproduce before conditions worsened. "The Everglades already knows," the girl commented. "It feels something is changing." Matteo nodded gravely. "And we must change too, Ixchel. I have lived too long in isolation, believing that the world had nothing more to offer me or I to the world. I was wrong." The girl looked at him with a wisdom that transcended her years. "My grandfather says no one is truly alone, that we are like drops of water. We seem separate, but we are actually part of the same underground river." The words resonated deeply in Matteo. For the first time in many years, he felt that the empty spaces within him were beginning to fill, not with the pain of the past, but with the purpose of the present and the hope of the future. As they reached the edge of the village, the staff in his hand vibrated with renewed intensity. Matteo stopped, confused, until Ixchel pointed toward a nearby creek that ran through the community. "Look," the girl said urgently. "The water—" The creek, which normally flowed clear and abundant even in the dry season, had shrunk to a muddy and foul-smelling trickle. On its banks, several small fish gasped desperately. "It's beginning," Matteo murmured, feeling a knot in his stomach. "The damage is spreading faster than we thought." Without the need for words, they both quickened their pace toward Don Kinich's house. There was no time to lose. The Ahail had chosen their moment of contact well. They were on the verge of a point of no return. News spread through Okeechobee like wildfire in a drought. Don Kinich called a community meeting under the great cypress tree in the central square. As evening fell, men and women of all ages gathered, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and concern. Matteo remained slightly apart, uncomfortable with so much attention. For years he had carefully cultivated his image as an eccentric hermit, the outsider, who preferred the company of plants and animals to that of other humans. Now, suddenly, he found himself at the center of a situation that required precisely what he had most avoided: social interaction, leadership, commitment to a community. Don Kinich began the meeting with a Seminole prayer, giving thanks to the four winds and the guardians of the earth and water. Then, with a clear voice that belied his age, he recounted ancient prophecies about the Ahail and explained the current situation. "What our ancestors feared is happening," he concluded. "The sacred water, the blood of our land, is being poisoned and diverted by those who only see what they can take, never what they must protect." A murmur ran through the assembly. Some elders nodded gravely, recognizing truths passed down through generations. Others, especially the younger ones with formal education, exchanged skeptical glances. "What about the promises of jobs and progress?" asked Miguel, a middle-aged man who worked sporadically in construction. "The Everglades Water Project promised to employ hundreds of local people." "What good are jobs if they destroy what gives us life?" replied an older woman, holding a baby. "Without clean water, without a healthy Everglades, what future will our children have?" The discussion grew in intensity. Matteo watched, amazed by the passion with which these seemingly quiet inhabitants defended their perspectives. He understood that he had underestimated the community, seeing it only as a backdrop for his self-imposed exile, not as a living organism with its own tensions, dreams, and fears. Don Kinich let the debate continue for a while, then raised a hand to call for silence. "Words and more words will solve nothing. We need to see to believe." He gestured toward Matteo. "Mr. Reyes has been chosen by the Ahail. He bears their mark and can show us the truth that lies beneath our feet." All eyes turned to him. Matteo stepped forward, uncomfortable but determined. He showed the mark on his palm, now visibly glowing in the twilight. "I'm nobody special," he began, his voice rough from disuse. "Like many of you, I came here seeking escape, but the Everglades doesn't let us escape for long. Eventually, it finds us and reminds us of our responsibilities." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I've seen what's happening beneath the surface. The underground rivers that connect all the sinkholes are being blocked, diverted, contaminated, not in the distant future, but right now. The creek that runs through the village already shows the first signs." Several people nodded, confirming that they had noticed worrying changes in the local water. "The Ahail have shown me where and how the damage is occurring," Matteo continued. "But they have also given me this." He took out the small vial containing the luminous drops. In the fading light, they shone like liquid stars, eliciting exclamations of astonishment from those present. "These marks will allow those who receive them to see what I have seen. I don't ask you to believe me. I ask you to see for yourselves." Don Kinich approached and took the vial. According to ancient teachings, these marks can only be accepted voluntarily, and they will only remain on those whose hearts are genuinely concerned for the well-being of the earth. The first to step forward was Doña Carmela, the village midwife and respected herbalist. "I've felt the changes in my bones," she said simply. "I want to see the truth." Don Kinich carefully extracted a drop from the vial and placed it on Doña Carmela's outstretched palm. The drop seemed to come alive on contact, expanding slightly before being absorbed by the skin, leaving a luminescent mark similar to Mateo's and Ixchel's. The woman's eyes widened in astonishment. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The water beneath us, it's suffering." One by one, other members of the community came forward. Not all, some remained skeptical on the sidelines, but enough. Each person who received the mark reacted similarly. Astonishment, then understanding, followed by a determination that transformed their faces. By the time the last drop was placed, more than 20 people bore the mark of the Ahail. They formed a diverse group. Elders whose knowledge went back to times when the sinkholes were openly revered. Mothers worried about the future of their children. Young people who had studied biology or agronomy and understood the fragility of the peninsular ecosystem. Even some who had initially defended the development project, but whose honesty allowed them to accept new information when they saw it with their own eyes. "Now, we must act," said Don Kinich. "Construction is advancing rapidly. Every day that passes, more damage is done to the underground system. But what can we do?" someone asked. "The Everglades Water Project has government permits, international financial backing, even its own private security." Mateo stepped forward. During the marking ceremony, an idea had been forming in his mind. "We can't confront them directly. It would be futile and dangerous. But there's something we can do, something the Ahail showed me." Using a branch, he drew a simplified map of the region on the ground. "Here is the construction project, and these are the main underground flows that are being affected. The Ahail showed me that there are ancient channels, naturally blocked centuries ago, that could be reopened to divert the water around the construction area, preserving the overall flow of the system." "Like creating a bypass for the water?" asked a young man who studied engineering at the State University during non-agricultural periods. "Exactly," Mateo confirmed, "but we need to work quickly and secretly. If the developers discover what we're doing, they'll try to stop us." Don Kinich nodded thoughtfully. "We will also need to document the damage they are already causing, evidence that we can present to environmental authorities, the press, international organizations. I can help with that," offered a young woman named Guadalupe, a teacher at the small local school. "My brother works in environmental journalism in Miami. He'll know who to contact." As more people joined the discussion, offering skills and resources, Mateo felt an almost forgotten emotion. Hope. Not the abstract and distant hope that someone would do something to fix the world's problems, but the concrete and active hope that arises when a group of ordinary people decide to act together for something that transcends their individual interests. The assembly continued well into the night, lit by torches and oil lamps. Committees were formed, tasks were assigned, contingency plans were developed. By sunrise, Okeechobee had transformed from a quiet village on the sidelines of events into a center of resistance and renewal. When the meeting finally broke up, Mateo found himself surrounded by people who had previously barely greeted him, with a distant gesture when they saw him at the general store or on the road. Now they spoke to him as an equal, an ally, even a friend. "Thank you for breaking your silence," Doña Carmela said as she said goodbye. "Sometimes those who most need to speak are those who are most silent." Mateo nodded, speechless to express the complex mix of emotions he felt. As he walked back to his cabin, accompanied by Ixchel, who insisted on not leaving him alone, now that everything is changing, he reflected on how a chance encounter with an impossible creature had untangled years of self-imposed isolation. The Everglades around him seemed more alive than ever, pulsating with meanings he hadn't perceived before, or perhaps they had always been there, waiting for him to be ready to listen. The first obstacle didn't take long to appear. Just 2 days after the assembly, while a small group discreetly explored the limits of the project to identify points where the ancient channels could be reopened, they encountered a newly installed barrier and security guards patrolling the perimeter. "They've expanded the construction zone," reported Jacinto, one of the explorers, at an urgent meeting at Don Kinich's house. And they've put up signs warning about environmental sabotage by anti-progress radicals. Someone tipped them off, Matteo murmured grimly. Not everyone in the village supported their efforts. Some had personal interests in the project, promises of employment or compensation for land sold. That complicates our original plan, said Don Kinich, but it doesn't make it impossible. The old man unfolded an ancient map drawn on deerskin on the table. It showed cave systems and underground rivers with surprising detail. This map is 7 generations old, he explained. It shows passages that modern explorers haven't even discovered yet. There are ways to access the system from points outside the guarded zone. Matteo studied the map carefully, mentally comparing it to the images the Arhail had shown him. This could work, he finally said, but we'll need specialized equipment. Small but powerful pumps, flexible pipes, systems to monitor the water flow. I can get some of that equipment, offered the young engineer. At the university, we have a hydrology lab. I can request materials for a supposed field project. And I know experienced cenote divers who will sympathize with our cause, added another member of the group. They've seen firsthand how uncontrolled tourism has damaged some of the most fragile systems. While the technical discussion continued, Ixchel, who had remained unusually silent, gently tugged on Matteo's sleeve. The Arhail are restless, she whispered. My mark has been pulsing since last night. Matteo looked at his own palm. Indeed, the mark glowed with a faster rhythm than usual. What do you think it means? I think something is changing in the water, something serious. Matteo stood up abruptly. We need to check the main sinkhole now. Don Kinich, sensing the urgency in his voice, nodded. Take Jacinto and Carmela with you. They're the best trackers. The small group set off immediately, carrying lamps and basic equipment. The sun was beginning to set, dyeing the Everglades in long shadows that seemed to reach out toward them like hungry fingers. Halfway there, they found the first indication that something was terribly wrong. A creek that normally flowed crystal clear now carried murky water with a disturbing greenish tint. Small dead fish floated on the stagnant banks. Chemicals, Carmela murmured, cautiously smelling the water. Industrial, not natural. They quickened their pace, increasingly worried. When they finally reached the sinkhole clearing, the scene they found confirmed their worst fears. The water, once perfectly transparent, now showed alarming turbidity. A grayish foam accumulated on the banks, and a pungent chemical odor replaced the clean mineral scent that had previously characterized the place. They've reached this far, Matteo said, his voice cracking. Somehow their operations are already affecting this sinkhole, even though it's miles away from the construction. The system is more connected than we thought, Jacinto explained, or they're deliberately pumping their waste into the aquifers. Matteo knelt by the edge and submerged his marked hand in the contaminated water. He immediately felt a current of pain, not physical, but emotional. The anguish of the Arhail at the destruction of their home. They're suffering, he murmured, and they're moving, retreating to the deeper parts of the system that haven't yet been affected. Carmela placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Then we must act faster than we planned. Tonight. Matteo nodded, a new determination replacing his initial despair. We need to implement the contingency plan. We don't have time for subtleties. As the group hurried back to the village to mobilize the others, Matteo recalled the words he had heard so many times in his previous life as an environmental activist in the capital, before pain and disillusionment led him to self-exile. When it comes to nature, it's never too late until it is. They were getting dangerously close to that final point. The rain began around midnight, a dense curtain that blurred the outlines of the Everglades and turned the trails into muddy streams. For any other operation, it would have been a major inconvenience. For the plan that Matteo and the marked members of Okeechobee had developed, it was an unexpected blessing. Divided into 5 groups, they dispersed to strategic points around the perimeter of the Everglades water project. The rain provided natural camouflage, muffling sounds and reducing the visibility of the guards patrolling the area. Matteo led the main group, composed of himself, Jacinto, the young engineer named Roberto, and 2 experienced divers who had arrived that same day from Key Largo responding to the urgent call. They carried the most critical equipment, compact high-power pumps, flexible pipes, and an experimental device that Roberto had adapted from hydrological sensors used in his university studies. According to the ancient map, the entrance to the main cavern should be nearby, Matteo whispered, consulting both the plastic-protected parchment and the mark on his palm, which pulsed with increasing intensity as they approached. "There," Jacinto pointed, indicating a rock formation partially hidden by dense vegetation. "The Jaguar's maw." Indeed, the opening in the limestone rock, viewed from a certain angle, vaguely resembled the open jaws of the large feline. Mateo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain soaking his clothes. The ancient Seminoles had identified this place centuries ago, marking it as a crucial point in the underground hydrological system. With quick but careful movements, the group began to descend through the opening. The divers, equipped with powerful lamps attached to their helmets, led the way, securing ropes to facilitate the descent through the narrow, natural chimney. The interior of the cavern was another world. Stalactites and stalagmites formed columns that seemed to support the limestone ceiling. But the most impressive thing was the underground river that flowed silently through the center of the main chamber, its crystalline waters reflecting the lights of their lamps. "It's still clean here," one of the divers murmured with evident relief. "The contamination hasn't reached this section." "Not yet," Mateo corrected. "If we don't act, it's only a matter of days, maybe hours." Roberto consulted a device that had been monitoring since they descended. "The current flows exactly as we predicted, but there's an artificial obstruction about 200 meters in that direction, right below the main construction area. They've installed some kind of barrier or diversion." Mateo nodded grimly. "That's what the Arhail showed me. They're capturing the clean water for their luxury pools and spas and returning contaminated water to the system." "Criminals," Jacinto murmured, with barely contained anger. "And everything perfectly legal according to their falsified permits. Let's focus on what we can change," Roberto intervened. "According to my calculations, if we install the pumps here and here," he pointed to 2 points on a map he had drawn based on combined information from ancient documents and modern data, "we can reactivate a secondary channel that was naturally blocked centuries ago. That will create a bypass around their obstruction." "Won't they notice the reduction in flow to their facilities?" one of the divers asked. "Eventually, yes," Roberto admitted. "But by then, we hope to have enough documented evidence to force an official review of the project." While they discussed the final details, Mateo felt a subtle change in his mark. It not only pulsed now, but emitted a more intense glow, almost white at its center. Without consciously thinking about it, he stepped away from the group and walked toward a secluded section of the cavern where the water formed a small pool. There, barely visible beneath the surface, glowed a familiar light, an Arhail sphere, smaller than the one in the main sinkhole, but unmistakable in its nature. "They've come to help us," Mateo understood with astonishment. He knelt by the water and submerged his marked hand. Immediately, images flowed into his consciousness. Other spheres, dozens of them, strategically positioned throughout the underground system, preparing to amplify the effects of the human intervention they were about to undertake. "Mateo, are you all right?" Jacinto's voice brought him back to immediate reality. "Better than all right," he replied, a smile forming on his tired face. "We're not alone in this. The Arhail are coordinating with us." For the next few hours, they worked with precision and urgency, installing pumps, connecting pipes, carefully moving natural obstructions without damaging the delicate ecology of the cavern. The divers submerged themselves in flooded passages, guiding flexible pipes through narrow tunnels that connected different sections of the system. As they worked, Mateo noticed how the small Arhail spheres appeared briefly near each installation, as if supervising, or perhaps even subtly adjusting the human work with their own abilities. "It's like we're remembering an ancient cooperation, not starting a new one," he commented to Roberto when the young engineer expressed astonishment at how accurately his theoretical plans matched the reality of the terrain. Finally, near dawn, the crucial moment arrived. With all the pumps in position and the pipes correctly aligned, all that remained was to activate the system. Roberto checked his calculations one last time, while the others strategically positioned themselves to monitor different points in the system. "Ready when you are," he finally announced. Mateo looked at each member of the team, seeing in their tired but determined faces the same commitment he felt burning within him. Then, with a gesture that felt almost ritualistic, he submerged his marked hand in the water again. "Now," he said simply. Roberto flipped the main switch. The pumps sprang to life with a low hum that reverberated through the cavern. For the first few seconds, nothing seemed to change. Then, gradually, the water level in the underground river began to fall at one point, while rising at another. "It's working!" Jacinto exclaimed. "The water is finding the new path." As the hydraulic bypass began to establish itself, the Ahail spheres reacted. Their lights intensified, and they began to move rapidly through the new currents, as if programming the water to follow the newly created course. It was then that they felt the first vibration. Subtle at first, barely perceptible beneath the noise of the pumps, but quickly gaining intensity. "What's that?" one of the divers asked, alarmed. "Tremor," Jacinto replied, his face paling under the lamplight. "The Earth is reacting to the change in water flow." Roberto quickly consulted his instruments. "It's not exactly a seismic tremor. It's more like a redistribution of pressure. The system has been under artificial stress for months, and now that we're releasing that stress, the balance is being restored," Mateo completed, feeling through his connection with the Ahail that what was happening, although potentially dangerous, was also necessary. Like a body that shakes to expel a toxin, the vibrations increased, causing small pieces of limestone to break off from the cavern ceiling. The water in the underground river seemed to boil, not from heat, but from the agitation of cross currents as the entire system reorganized itself. "We have to get out of here," one of the divers shouted. "The structure is becoming unstable." "Not yet," Mateo replied, his voice firm despite the fear he felt. "If we leave now, the whole process could reverse. We need to make sure the new flow is fully established." Even as he spoke, he noticed how the Ahail spheres multiplied, appearing from the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the system. They formed complex patterns that seemed to be actively stabilizing the most critical sections of the cavern, containing imminent collapses, directing the forces of the water. "They're holding the structure," Mateo explained, pointing toward the dancing lights. "They're giving us time." The others watched with astonishment mixed with awe. For most, it was the first time they had directly seen the Ahail in action, not just through the visions shared by their marks. "I never imagined," Roberto whispered. "All my scientific education and never—" "Some truths don't go into textbooks," Mateo replied with a small smile, remembering his own initial incredulity. For 20 eternal minutes, the group remained in the cavern while the underground world seemed to reorganize itself around them. Gradually, the vibrations subsided. The water found new, smoother, more harmonious flow patterns. The small rockfalls ceased. The Ahail spheres, which had maintained strategic positions throughout the crisis, began to regroup. They formed a three-dimensional constellation on the water's surface, pulsing in unison, in a pattern that Mateo recognized as an expression of approval. "We did it," he said, his voice breaking with fatigue and emotion. "The bypass is working. The clean water is flowing around the contaminated area and will eventually cleanse even that section." Roberto consulted his instruments one last time. "Confirmed. Pressure levels are stabilizing throughout the system. And look at this." His screen showed a map of hydraulic flow. Where there had previously been a massive obstruction under the construction area, new blue lines now appeared, indicating water flowing freely. "The calculation is perfect," the young engineer continued with professional enthusiasm. "We're diverting approximately 70% of the clean water around their facilities. In a matter of days, they'll notice a dramatic reduction in the supply for their pools and golf courses. And by then," Jacinto added, "our other teams will have finished documenting all the environmental violations and filed the corresponding complaints." Mateo approached the edge of the water. The Ahail spheres now floated in a perfect circle, as if waiting. He submerged his marked hand, immediately receiving images of gratitude and renewed hope. The message was clear. This was only the first battle in a larger war for balance, but they had demonstrated that cooperation between humans and Ahail could achieve what neither could do alone. "Now we should go," he finally said. "Dawn is near, and the construction crews will start their activities soon." As they gathered their equipment, leaving only the carefully camouflaged pumps and pipes, Mateo noticed that one of the Ahail spheres was separating from the main group and approaching him. It was smaller than the others, with a glow that varied between turquoise and indigo, immediately reminding him of the first one he had seen in the sinkhole. With a fluid movement, the sphere rose from the water and floated directly toward him, stopping at eye level. There were no words, not even images this time, only a deep feeling of mutual recognition and shared promise. "I'll see you again too," Mateo replied to the nonverbal communication. The sphere pulsed one last time, intensely, then submerged again into the now clarified waters of the underground river. The ascent to the surface was laborious but uneventful. When they finally emerged into the grayish light of the rainy dawn, they found Ixchel waiting for them, sheltered from the rain under a makeshift palmetto shelter. "Mr. Reyes!" the girl exclaimed, running toward them. "It worked! The village creek is already clearer, and look!" She extended her palm where the mark she had received glowed with renewed intensity, forming a pattern that mimicked the flow of healthy water. "All the marks in the village are like that," she continued. "My grandfather says it's the Arhail's way of saying they're pleased." Mateo smiled, his fatigue momentarily forgotten in the face of the girl's enthusiasm. "It's just the beginning, Ixchel. We have much more work to do." The reaction was faster and more forceful than they had anticipated. Only 3 days after the operation in the cavern, a fleet of official vehicles descended on Okeechobee. Officials from the Department of Environmental Protection, representatives of the development company, and a contingent of state troopers. "What do we do?" Jacinto asked, watching from the porch of the community store as the vehicles stopped in front of Don Keenich's house. "Nothing," Mateo replied calmly. "This is exactly what we expected to happen." In the days following the operation, as the company's complaints about the mysterious reduction in water supply grew, the group had worked tirelessly. The divers had documented with videos and samples the pollution that the Everglades Water Project was pouring into the aquifer. Guadalupe and her journalist brother had compiled a detailed report that was simultaneously sent to multiple national and international environmental organizations, as well as selected media outlets. And most importantly, they had ensured that representatives from the Water Management District, alerted by Roberto's university contacts, conducted surprise inspections that officially confirmed the violations. "But they can intimidate local officials," Jacinto insisted. "It's happened before." "Not this time," Mateo said, discreetly pointing toward the sky where a drone, operated by Guadalupe's brother's team, was recording everything that was happening. "Besides, we have something we never had before." He lightly touched the mark on his palm, now a symbol shared by a large part of the community. The confrontation in the main square was tense but orderly. The representative of the development company, a man in an impeccable suit who seemed absurdly out of place under the relentless sun, presented official documents that supposedly proved that all their operations complied with environmental regulations. "We have all the necessary permits," he declared with barely concealed arrogance. "The accusations of sabotage against our project are serious and will have legal consequences." Don Keenich, backed by almost the entire village, responded with the serene dignity that characterized him. "We also have documents, sir. Documents older and truer than yours." At his signal, Guadalupe and Roberto unfurled large posters showing photos and scientific graphs detailing the damage caused to the aquifer. At the same time, 2 officials from the Water Management District who had arrived separately presented their own preliminary reports, confirming the violations. "We have found alarming levels of industrial pollutants in nearby sinkholes," the lead official explained. "Pollutants that exactly match those used in your construction operations." The corporate representative visibly paled. He hadn't expected to encounter solid scientific evidence backed by federal authorities, only superstitious villagers whom he could easily intimidate. "There must be some mistake," he stammered. "Perhaps contamination from other sources." "The source is clearly identified," Roberto interrupted, pointing to a detailed hydrological map. "The underground currents carry the pollutants directly from your facilities to these sinkholes." "It's basic fluid mechanics, sir." The technical discussion continued for hours under the scorching sun. The inhabitants of Okeechobee watched with expressions ranging from cautious hope to frank satisfaction. For many, it was the first time they had seen corporate progress representatives back down in the face of irrefutable evidence presented by their own community. Mateo remained slightly apart, letting Don Keenich, Roberto, and Guadalupe lead the confrontation. His role had been crucial in the initial stages, but now he understood that this needed to become a collective victory, not exclusively associated with him. Ixchel quietly approached his side. "My grandfather says you've changed, Mr. Reyes, that before you were like stagnant water and now you flow again." Mateo smiled at the aquatic metaphor, so appropriate. "Your grandfather has always been wiser than I am, little one. The Arhail are watching," the girl continued, discreetly pointing toward the central fountain of the square, where, almost imperceptible beneath the reflection of the sun on the water. A faint turquoise glow pulsed rhythmically. Matteo nodded. I know. They're everywhere there's water. They always have been. We had just forgotten how to see them. As they contemplated the confrontation that was gradually transforming into a negotiation, the corporate representatives, now on the defensive, seeking a compromise to limit the damage to their reputation, Matteo reflected on how a chance encounter in a lost sinkhole had changed not only his life, but potentially the future of the entire region. The following days brought rapid and surprising developments. The media pressure, amplified by Guadalupe's brother's report, and the shocking images of documented pollution, forced state authorities to temporarily suspend the Everglades water project, pending a complete environmental review. Subsequent inspections, now conducted with public scrutiny focused on every detail, revealed even more serious violations than they had initially documented. The project, which had begun as a symbol of luxury tourist development, quickly became a flagship case of corporate abuse and government complicity. A week after the confrontation in the square, Matteo received an unexpected visit at his cabin. Ernesto Valladares, one of the project's main investors, arrived alone in a modest rental car instead of the ostentatious SUVs his subordinates preferred. Mr. Reyes, he greeted formally, I'd like to talk to you. In private, if possible. Matteo invited him to sit on the simple wooden benches in front of his cabin. For several minutes, the businessman silently observed the surroundings. The vibrant Everglades, the small garden Matteo cultivated, the clouds moving over the endless green canopy. It's beautiful here, he finally said. I can understand why you fight to protect it. Not just me, Matteo corrected, an entire community. And not just for the superficial beauty, but for what is not seen, the living system beneath our feet. Valladares nodded slowly. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've personally reviewed all the reports, both the official ones and those presented by your group. The evidence is irrefutable. We made serious mistakes, some out of ignorance, others, he paused, visibly uncomfortable, others out of greed and deliberate negligence. Matteo listened without interrupting, surprised by the man's apparent sincerity. I've decided to withdraw my investment from the project in its current form, Valladares continued, but I wonder if there's an alternative, an approach that genuinely respects this unique ecosystem while still allowing for some economic development for the region. Why are you telling me this? Matteo asked. Don Quinich is the respected leader here. Guadalupe and Roberto handle the technical and media aspects. Valladares looked him straight in the eye. Because according to all the reports, you were the one who started all this, and because, like me, you come from outside. You understand both worlds. Matteo reflected on this observation. It was true. Despite his years in the Everglades, he would never truly be part of the Seminole community in the same way as those born and raised there. His perspective would always contain elements of both worlds. Any alternative would have to begin with non-negotiable basic principles, he finally said. Total transparency, independent supervision, real economic benefits for the local community, not just low-level temporary jobs, and most importantly, absolute protection of the aquifer. And the water keepers? Valladares asked cautiously. I've heard rumors. Matteo instinctively covered the mark on his palm. Some aspects of this place are beyond commercial negotiation, Mr. Valladares. Some knowledge must be earned, not bought. The businessman nodded, accepting the implicit answer. I understand. Would you be willing to participate in a broader discussion about possible alternatives? With the entire community involved, of course. It's not up to me to decide that, Matteo replied. But if the community accepts dialogue, I won't object. When Valladares left, Matteo remained seated in front of his cabin, contemplating the exchange. Was a middle ground possible between uncontrolled development and total preservation? Could the traumatic experience transform into a new model of coexistence? He had no definitive answers, but for the first time in many years, he felt part of something bigger than his own pain and isolation. The mark on his palm pulsed gently, as if confirming his thoughts. That night, as the full moon bathed the Everglades in liquid silver, Matteo walked alone to the main sinkhole. The water, he noted with satisfaction, had regained much of its crystalline clarity. Nature had an amazing ability to heal when given the opportunity. He sat on the edge, his bare feet barely touching the surface. He didn't need to call or make any ritual gesture. The luminous sphere emerged by itself, as if it had been waiting for his visit. This time, however, it was not alone. Dozens of smaller spheres accompanied it, forming complex patterns that Matteo now recognized as their natural way of communication. It was not just one entity communicating with him, but an entire community. He submerged his marked hand in the water and received not specific images but feelings, gratitude, hope, and something harder to define, an invitation. "Do you want to show me something?" he asked aloud. The spheres pulsed in unison, their glow intensifying. The largest one approached the surface, expanding slightly. Matteo understood what was being offered to him. With a deep breath to calm his nervousness, he slid completely into the water. The sensation was indescribable. It wasn't like swimming normally. The water seemed to support him, guide him, as the spheres surrounded him in a luminous dance. The mark on his palm glowed so intensely that it illuminated everything around him, creating a golden path through the crystalline water. He descended deeper than would have been possible without scuba gear, but surprisingly, he didn't feel a lack of air. It was as if the water itself provided the oxygen he needed. The spheres guided him through underwater tunnels, hidden chambers, and passages that connected the entire system. He saw the true extent of the hydrological network. Vast, intricate, beautiful, beyond any human description. And at the heart of the system, in a chamber of impossible dimensions, he saw the crystalline city that the Ahail called home. It wasn't a structure in the human sense, but a collective living organism, pulsating with ancient knowledge and shared purpose. There, in that place that no modern human had ever witnessed, Matteo received the complete vision. Not only the immediate crisis they had faced, but the greater challenges that would come with climate change, the increasing pressure of development, and the progressive disconnection between humanity and nature. He also saw possibilities, new forms of coexistence, technologies inspired by the Ahail's principles that would allow human development without environmental destruction, education that would reintegrate ancient knowledge with modern science. When he finally emerged from the sinkhole, the moon had completed much of its journey across the night sky. Hours had passed, although to Matteo the experience had seemed timeless. He lay on the edge of the sinkhole, drenched but strangely energized. He knew now with a certainty that transcended mere intellectual conviction that his chance encounter with the Ahail had not been accidental at all. It had been the first step on a path he was only beginning to glimpse. The mark on his palm was no longer simply a symbol of connection with the waterkeepers. It was a constant reminder that the barriers between worlds, human and natural, visible and invisible, past and future, were far more permeable than most dared to imagine. And in that permeability lay both the greatest danger and the greatest hope for all. A year later, Matteo watched the sunset from a natural overlook that offered a panoramic view of both the village and the area that would have housed the Everglades Water Project. Where cranes and excavators once stood, native vegetation was growing again, strategically replanted to accelerate the ecosystem's recovery. The original project had been officially cancelled 3 months after the initial confrontation. Subsequent investigations had uncovered a web of corruption that resulted in the resignation of several state officials and a complete restructuring of the agencies responsible for granting environmental permits. But the most surprising thing wasn't the failure of the destructive project, but what arose in its place. Ernesto Valladares, true to his word, had returned with a radically different proposal: a center for research and education on Mayan aquifer ecosystems, designed with principles of extreme sustainability and governed by a mixed council that included representatives of the local community, independent scientists, and entrepreneurs committed to a new model of development. Valladares' transformation from corporate predator to sustainability promoter had initially generated skepticism, but when he invested his personal fortune in the project, forgoing immediate profits in favor of long-term results, even the most distrustful began to reconsider. "It's incredible how everything has changed," commented Ixchel, now a 13-year-old teenager who had joined Matteo in his evening contemplation. Her knowledge of medicinal plants and local traditions, combined with a growing passion for modern science, had made her an invaluable assistant to the research team. "And also how some things remain the same," Matteo replied, pointing toward the main sinkhole, visible as a perfect circle of deep blue amidst the green of the Everglades. The Guardians are still there watching, waiting. Since the initial confrontation, the presence of the Ahail had taken on a new dimension in the community's life. They were no longer just legendary figures in ancient stories, but active collaborators, though invisible to most in the protection and restoration of the aquifer system. The marked individuals, now more than 50 among the local community and external allies, formed a network of interpreters who could communicate with the waterkeepers and transmit their knowledge. Under Don Kainich's guidance, they had developed strict protocols to determine who could receive the mark and what information could be shared with the outside world. "How's the new map coming?" Ixchel asked, referring to the project that occupied much of Mateo's time lately. "Progressing," he replied. "Roberto and I completed the northeast sector last week. It's amazing how many connections we had overlooked in the previous maps." The New Water Codex, as they had christened it, was an ambitious attempt to document the complete hydrological system of the peninsula, combining modern scientific knowledge with the ancestral wisdom of the Seminoles and the unique information provided by the Ahail. It was both a practical document for environmental protection and a symbolic bridge between seemingly separate worlds. "Mum says the tourists who come now are different," Ixchel commented. "They come to learn, not just to take pictures." It was true. The modest ecotourism program that had replaced the megalomaniac hotel project attracted mainly students, researchers, and conscious travelers interested in authentic and educational experiences. The income was less than that promised by the luxury resort, but it was distributed more equitably among the community and had minimal environmental impact. "Your mother has been an excellent administrator," Mateo acknowledged. Ixchel's mother, who had previously barely survived selling handicrafts, now coordinated guided tours and educational programs, applying her deep cultural knowledge in ways that generated both respect and decent income. A golden flash in the sinkhole's water caught his attention. Even from this distance, Mateo could distinguish the characteristic glow of an Ahail sphere briefly emerging to the surface before submerging again. His own mark responded with a gentle pulse, a constant reminder of the connection that now defined his existence. He was no longer the man who had fled to the Everglades to escape pain and disillusionment, seeking solitude as his only refuge. He now understood that even in his darkest moments, he had never been truly alone. Water, the element that connects all life, had always been there, carrying in its eternal flow both memory and possibility. "Mr. Reyes," Ixchel said suddenly, interrupting his reflections, "do you think that someday everyone will be able to see the Ahail, not just those who are marked?" The question resonated deeply. Mateo had often thought about this, especially during his immersions in the sinkhole, when communication with the Guardians was more direct. "I think that's the direction we're moving toward, little one," he replied carefully. "Not necessarily that everyone will see exactly what we see, but that more and more people will recognize the intelligence and consciousness that exists beyond the human." He pointed toward the research center under construction, where scientists and traditional knowledge keepers collaborated on equal terms. "Every barrier we break down between different forms of knowledge brings us a little closer." Ixchel nodded, satisfied with the answer. At her young age, she navigated with surprising ease between worlds that previous generations had perceived as irreconcilable: science and tradition, modernity and ancestral heritage, development and conservation. "My grandfather says the Ahail have always been waiting for this moment," she commented. "A time when we remember how to listen to the water." Mateo smiled at the profound simplicity of the observation. "Your grandfather, as always, is right." The sun finally sank below the horizon, dyeing the sky in oranges and purples. The first stars began to appear, reflecting on the perfectly still surface of the distant sinkhole. In that moment of transition between day and night, Mateo felt with extraordinary clarity the network of connections that defined his new life. His bond with the Ahail through the mark on his palm, his relationship with the community that had welcomed him after years of self-imposed isolation, the wider network of scientists, activists, and visionaries who were transforming potential tragedy into an opportunity for renewal. But perhaps the most significant thing was his renewed connection with himself. The broken man who had sought refuge in the solitude of the Everglades was still there. Those wounds would never completely disappear. But now those cracks had become channels through which new forms of compassion and purpose flowed. like the underground rivers that find unexpected paths through the limestone. "It's time to go back," he finally said, standing up and offering a hand to Ixchel. "We have a lot of work tomorrow." As they descended the path toward the village lights that were beginning to glow in the growing darkness, Mateo reflected on how a seemingly chance encounter with an impossible creature had triggered a cascade of transformations, both personal and collective. The Ahail, he now understood, hadn't chosen just a solitary man to receive their message. They had recognized the potential of an entire community to remember ancient truths and discover new possibilities. And in that mutual recognition between species, separated by chasms of difference but united by the shared water that gives life to all, there was a seed of hope for even greater challenges that awaited on the horizon. "Water has memory," Don Kinnich had once told him. "It remembers every form it has taken, every place it has flowed, every being it has sustained." Now Mateo would add, "Water also has a future. It contains possibilities yet unrealized, connections yet undiscovered, harmonies yet unheard, and learning to listen to those future melodies was perhaps the most important task they had ahead of them. My friends, we have reached the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you take from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video playing on your screen. This story will impact you. Until next time.